going to take a couple of seconds to load the live stream. So give me about 30 seconds.
Can everyone online hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Thank you. We're just getting the live stream up and running and then we can get started.
Okay, good to go.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We are here today for the July meeting of the Passive Recreation Lands Subcommittee. Kevin, did you want to run the agenda virtually, or would you like me to just lead us through the agenda today?
I think since you guys are in person, if someone wouldn't mind sharing in the room, that would be great.
I can do that. So I did share the agenda virtually with everyone. So those of you on Zoom, that should be in your inboxes. But to start off, we can just do a quick roll call. We'll start with who's in the room and then we can go online. So I am Jill Carter. I am the Open Space Bond Project Manager and the Secretary for this sub.
Thomas Gold, Principal Park Planner with Buncombe County Parks and Recreation.
Ann Babcock, member of the subcommittee.
Bob Gale, Land Conservation Advisory Board and member of the subcommittee.
Allison Baines, Parks and Recreation Director for okay.
Jennifer Harrison, Economic Resources.
Catalina with Cape and Parks and Rec.
For those of you online, Catalina just joined the county and she'll be she's doing a lot of the communications work for the Parks and Recreation Department. So she is live streaming this meeting for us and being a great asset. But we can move to those of you online to introduce yourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Kevin Convergood. I'm the subcommittee chair.
Matt Fusco, co-chair on the subcommittee.
Lena Richards, Parks Rec advisory member and subcommittee member.
Allie Howell, same as Lena.
Great. Thank you all for joining. Our first item on the agenda is to approve the agenda. So Kevin, if you can call for a motion to approve the agenda for this meeting.
All in favor to approve the motions for this agenda for this meeting?
Aye.
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 All opposed? The motion is adopted.
Great. And then second, if we can get a motion to approve the minutes from the June meeting, which have also been provided to everyone at agenda.
I'll move about the accepted minutes from the last meeting.
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes for the prior meeting?
Aye.
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 And all opposed? All right, meeting approved. Meeting minutes approved.
Thank you. So today's presentation, I will be sharing. As you all know, we have been in the middle of a public engagement process to source input from our community on passive recreation lands, and also educate our public on what passive recreation is, what it can look like, what potential projects to be funded by this bond can look like, and use that engagement to start drafting our criteria. So today I'm going to share the results of that public input process so far, and use this as an opportunity to see if any of you have questions, if there's additional questions and ideas we want to bring forward to the public, and then also share how that has resulted in our first initial draft criteria. So again, this public engagement process was focused on both education and kind of vision setting for passive recreation. Because this is a very new project type for the county, we wanted to get a sense of what passive recreation should look like for Buncombe County and what would make a good project in this passive recreation space. So we have done so through a few different channels. First, our CAVE team has put out a lot of really great educational content on passive recreation. There's been some great videos focused on Collier Cove, which is a great example of passive recreation. And we've also had some polls and social media content as well. CAVE has also helped secure us some great media coverage about passive recreation and the bond process, including an article on the county website, an article with WLOS, and an interview with Blue Ridge Public Radio. Again, those media coverage were all focused on that education piece, as well as driving listeners and readers to our public engagement process. We then had 2 community meetings. One was a stakeholder meeting and one was a more of a general public meeting to share some educational content on what passive rec is, what it isn't, what are some great examples, as well as source initial ideas and feedback from the public. And then finally, we have had an online survey that's been going on for a couple of months now. And we have directed people to that survey through these meetings, through that media coverage. And then our CAVE team has also been sharing that survey at different community events throughout the last month or so. And again, for this process, we have kind of sourced some high-level visions for passive recreation that came out of those meetings, different conversations we've been having, and the survey. And these high-level pieces are first a big interest in environmental education. The community wants to see these passive recreation projects have opportunities for education about habitats, for land stewardship, and wildlife protection. Additionally, there's been a strong emphasis on habitat protection and restoration and how these lands and projects can be used to support conservation efforts. And you'll see that come through in some of the data I'll share as well. We also heard a lot of desire for collaboration in this process. I think the community recognizes that these projects will require a lot of relationship building between the people leading these projects, between local experts. There's a big call for us to engage with Indigenous communities and how we design and manage these projects. We being the people managing the projects, not just the county, since we are having external applicants as well. And also a desire to collaborate with the community and how these projects are designed. And then finally, another big theme that came out was smart development. Wanting to work with the land, not against it, and also be systematic in how we approach passive recreation. Instead of just doing one-off projects, we want to see the bigger picture and make sure we're kind of thinking long-term in how we implement passive recreation in our county. So drilling down into kind of what the data that came out of this public engagement process looks like. We did have over 350 respondents for our survey, which is actually probably closer to 400 now, because I know I've seen a few more responses come in the last day or so. Also, our page for the bond has almost 4,000 views, which apparently is one of the largest viewerships on the county website. So we've had a lot of interest in this. And that's been great because we got some really interesting responses in this survey. We had first some kind of high-level questions that we asked before we kind of got into getting to criteria. First, we wanted to know what activities people wanted to see in passive recreation lands. And by far and away, the biggest was hiking. People really wanted to see more hiking trails. But there was also a lot of emphasis on having gathering areas on these lands. So like picnic tables, picnic shelters, have opportunities for families, groups to get together and socialize on these lands. Some other activities that we had put forward were things like the natural playgrounds, and again, those educational opportunities. We also asked how people wanted to access these lands. When we first started talking about passive recreation projects and how we were envisioning them as a staff, we realized the way people were going to get to them was a big question to us. And so we wanted to pose that to the public. And people really wanted to see this kind of connectivity between other trail systems and greenways and these passive recreation lands. And then following that, it was driving and parking at these lands, which I think obviously has a big implication for the need for parking spaces on some of these projects. Now, the next kind of big picture question that we asked, which was actually very surprising for us as a team, was we asked how the public wanted to see this money getting used. Did they want to see the majority of the funds going towards conserving land for future park development? Did they want to see the majority of the funds being towards improving existing passive recreation lands? Or did they want to see new projects? And I think my hypothesis was we're going to see people wanting new projects or improvements on existing lands, and that they were going to want to see projects that they can access today. But that was not the case. And in fact, the highest ranking option was using the majority of funds to conserve lands now and develop recreation opportunities later, which again was pretty surprising. And I think that gives us some interesting questions that I want to talk about as a subcommittee in terms of, does this mean we need to possibly consider 2 tracks for a request for proposals, where we have acquisition track and we have an improvements track? Do we need to weight those acquisition opportunities more heavily? And kind of what that means for passive recreation lands in the future of this bond. So after we asked those kind of high level questions, we did, as you have all seen, we've presented this at a previous meeting, but we as a staff came up with some possible characteristics of these passive recreation projects and what would make a good project. And we presented these characteristics in the survey and asked respondents to rank them in order of importance. And that conservation and environmental impact piece definitely came out on top by a bit of a long shot. A lot of people were really emphasizing, again, that environmental impact, reducing negative impact, but also promoting positive conservation efforts, things like pollinator gardens or native species planting. Second was accessibility in terms of geographic accessibility, physical accessibility. Next was the feasibility question. I think there's a big interest in this community of seeing things get done. Equity was number 4. Cost and leveraging of funds was number 5. And then alignment with county plans and needs was ranked number 6. We also, I'm going to skip forward real quick. We also asked if there were additional characteristics that we did not include that the public was interested in seeing. Those of you on the Recreation Advisory Board, this probably looks a little familiar with number 1 because this came through in greenways as well, but there was a big concern around safety. And this is safety, both like the physical safety of people using these lands, so things like avoiding collisions between cyclists and hikers. Also the physical safety of the trails themselves. Are they really steep? Are they like on sheer sides of cliff or whatnot? Safety from animals. There's a lot of worry about bears and snakes. And then safety from crime is a big one as well. And then again, wildlife protection came out here with the protecting habitats and biodiversity. Cleanliness of these lands was a big thing as well. Wanting to make sure that we had plans for removing waste and managing kind of trash on these spaces, as well as managing invasive species. And then we talked about this a bit at the last subcommittee meeting, but this question of long-term maintenance and management of these projects came through a lot in this survey. The public really wants to make sure that these projects aren't just going to get funded once and then ignored. They want to see that they are maintained in the long term, that they are safe in the long term, they're clean, that there's trail maintenance going on. And they're something that the community can continue to enjoy in perpetuity.
So Jill, these are then like write-ins?
Yes, these are right.
And did they supersede the things that we were listing? Like were these, or?
So I guess, do you mean like, were they more emphasizing?
Yeah, were people saying, actually, the number one thing we care about is safety, or the number one? Or was it not
really
set
have
up
a
that way to
mechanism
tease
to
it out?
determine
Yeah.
that, to
Okay.
be fair? So I think as we go back with the refined criteria, that's something we definitely
Yeah.
need to explore further. Is like, safety came out, was that more important to people than the environmental protection piece,
Right.
or not?
Jill, I had a question too on one of the earlier slides. And I can't remember the survey questions, but on the one that showed, excuse me, accessibility was right up here, and then equity was a couple.
Yeah.
lower. Yeah. I was trying to remember the depth of the questions. So people, when they were answering, like, accessibility means how easy it is to just park there, or does that tie in with equity? Is it accessible to people who might not be able to they don't have a car, they can't drive there and park, but they can take a bus if the bus goes there? How are those two linked? Because,
So that's a great question, because that, in the survey itself, we left it just as these high level terms and
Sure.
words. But in those public engagement meetings, we did ask participants to elaborate further and say, like, what does accessibility mean to you? What does equity mean to you? What does and that's where we got some more details around. For some people, accessibility does mean, like ADA accessibility, making sure that regardless of physical ability, you can use these places. Some people define accessibility as that accessibility to anyone, regardless of geographic location, making sure that they can come to these parks and use these parks. And accessibility also is sometimes defined as like they need to be free and open to the public. Cost should not be a barrier to people. So there are multiple ways to define accessibility, and we can hash that out, like that definition. I will say for the greenways, the way we did that is we kind of included all of those elements as part of the accessibility criteria. If the subcommittee wants to follow a similar route, we can do that, or we can be more specific, I guess, more narrowly defined in how we talk about accessibility.
A lot of them are just like definitely linked together, because you could throw even a further kind of confusion in there, because like safety actually is like related to accessibility, and that if people don't feel safe, then they kind of self-eliminate or so they're definitely like multiple ways that all of these things kind of interact with each other. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got a question too on that same slide,
Yeah.
On the feasibility part. Of course, on the greenways, there has to be an actual feasibility study in place. How do you define feasibility? Because if it's a new acquisition, obviously there won't be a feasibility plan.
Right. So I think that's something, again, that this subcommittee can help us decide what we want to require versus what is, an added points in the feasibility column. So as you remember for greenways, we have feasibility study as a requirement, but then there's also the feasibility as part of the weighted criteria and scored on a scale. So if something is, further along in the process, or if they have like letters of support, or if the topography lends really well to putting a greenway there, then it would score higher on feasibility than a project that does not have those. And for passive recreation, as a staff, we have not talked about requiring a feasibility study, and I think that would potentially eliminate a lot of possible applicants who did require a feasibility study, but that we haven't made a firm decision on that. So if this subcommittee does want to make that a requirement or make some other baseline level of feasibility requirement, we can. And then also to that question of, do we want to have separate tracks for acquisitions versus improvements? If we do that, there would obviously be different requirements for an acquisition proposal versus an improvement proposal. Because improvement, we would need to see like designs and that management plan. But an acquisition, we might not need all of the same details, but there would be different questions that we need to ask for that. So I think this subcommittee can definitely help define that.
Yeah, I think with feasibility too, we're definitely talking about it has to happen within the window of the bond. Who knows what kind of proposals we'll get, but there's going to be some some due diligence that has to be done on each of the proposals. Do the applicants actually own the land that they're proposing a project on? Do they have rights to the development on that land? Then there is this in a floodplain, like all of that kind of due diligence as well. But yeah, I'm sure there's other feasibility stuff as well, but that's the stuff that comes to mind off the top of my head. The main one there being, can it be done within the window defined by the
But
bond?
feasibility would also be tied up with costs as well.
Correct.
That's very good.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing is, do we think that this project can actually be done with the budget that the applicant is presenting? Yeah.
I know another element of feasibility we've talked about is like stakeholder support and like demonstrated stakeholder support. So if a proposed project requires partnership with different landowners or organizations or even private companies, like if they can demonstrate that they already have that relationship in place and that those entities are committed to getting it done, then that would also be part of the feasibility consideration.
So partnerships would, right?
I think that would go into that criteria bucket, yeah.
I suppose one other thing is that if there's this proposal, wow, we could really put this big piece of land in it or whatever. We have other proposals and this would sap a lot of the money, how do we balance out? Try to do the best with the limits financially, as you're saying.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the many important roles this subcommittee is going to play in the actual selection of projects to recommend to the commissioners, is because obviously we'll score the projects based on the evaluation criteria that we have, which I'll show that in a moment as well. But we'll score the projects, but it might be a case that a project that has scores on like a 85 versus a project that has an 80, the mix of projects also matters. And this subcommittee is responsible for helping identify what the right mix of projects is. And it might just be that the one that has an 80 is something that better fits with the mix that we want to see come out of this as well. And then the last question that we asked on the survey was really just a broad, are there other thoughts or ideas or concerns you have about passive recreation and this bond? And some of the main recurring themes that came out of that were connectivity, wanting this kind of continuous system of trails and greenways, connectivity to different neighborhoods and multimodal transportation options. The geographic distribution of these lands, which again, going to that ideal mix of these projects, there's a desire for these to be spread out, but also to prioritize areas that don't already have these passive recreation type lands in them. Also considering development pressure in that conversation. And then the impact on communities was a big one that I thought was pretty interesting. There's the typical impact that you think about with like traffic, increased noise and light pollution, and even if there's improvements happening on the land, the construction vehicles and the impact of that, but also the potential for these projects to drive gentrification in different communities. And there was a large desire for those impacts to be considered when looking at these projects, not just, oh, is this an ideal plot of land, but also how is it going to impact the people who live and work around these projects. And then finally, there was just, wanting us to keep at the center of this work. What did the voters want to see when they supported this bond? Which is pretty vague, but that's kind of what's driving this all together, right? Is we want to make sure we're being true to the purpose of this bond. So that was the public engagement feedback that we received in this process so far. We're not done. I'll talk about this more in a minute, but we are currently in the middle of a Spanish language push. And that's going to also impact how we refine the criteria. But I did want to pause and see if there was any additional questions or thoughts about what we've heard so far. Also, are there additional questions that you have that we could go back to the public and ask as we continue this public engagement process?
Just off the top of my head, thought when I saw what did the voters want with this bond, and just being in this area so long and knowing it, I think when they saw that, and I'm making an assumption here, but people generally just want to see more protection. Yeah. That's sort of a thought that's probably just in most people's mind. Now, when you start getting down into the details, they may have different ideas. Oh, but I don't want it to impact this and that. But overall, all those high ratings saw in the survey just seem to reflect that general. There's so much development going on here in the mountains. We want to see more protection. That's probably, that's my answer to that question.
And that acknowledgement of the development pressure in this area came out a lot in the survey as well. And in the conversations we had in the meetings. And
have you gotten any negative feedback?
Actually, surprised compared to some of the responses we got in the greenways, I feel like it's been a much more positive responses on this. Yeah, I'd say the only negatively skewed comments we got were about the potential conflict between open space and affordable housing, and how obviously affordable housing is a big issue in this area as well. And by prioritizing conservation of lands, are we potentially inhibiting our ability to provide affordable housing options? So that was we did receive a few comments around that, and that's something we've been talking about as a staff a lot as well. And how can we avoid that conflict, and how do we talk about the two bonds in a way that, since these work together, not against each other. And one thing we did add on the kind of oversight side of the bond was there's going to be like keep calling it cross-examination, but that's not the right word. There's going to be kind of a control assessment. So if there's a project for open space that might be on land that would be good for affordable housing, the Affordable Housing Committee will also review that project, and vice versa. If there's a housing project proposed on land that would be ideal for conservation, then the boards for this bond would review that project as well. So that's one of the, I guess, control measures we put.
There might be, in situations like that, hopefully there would also be kind of a win-win for both affordable housing and greenway going nearby it.
Yeah.
So there's access to that greenway that way. That was where my question on access and equity earlier. We wrestled with that at Mountain True for the last several years, and as the public lands director, I was always trying to figure out how do we get people can't get to the national forest, the national parks. They can't get out of the city to get there because they have no transportation, that kind of thing. So that would, seems like this more localized might have better, might be able to help that better somehow.
Yeah.
Make that happen, where more people in the city could get to these places.
That's a really great point. I think that presents a great opportunity for this bond and the other bond to work together. And I know the bond manager for affordable housing, she and I work very closely, and we've even talked about, let's make sure we're keeping each other aware of opportunities where there might be a project that is adjacent to an affordable housing project or vice versa. So, awesome. All right. So the draft criteria, this should look vaguely familiar. It did get expanded based on the public engagement we've received. But this kind of draft criteria that we want to get your feedback on, and we're going to share with stakeholders for their feedback as well, is first, how does the project, again, minimize negative and maximize positive conservation and environmental impact? How does the project ensure accessibility for all in our community? How feasible is it to complete the project within the constraints of the bond? How does the project promote equity in our community? Does the project minimize costs and leverage funding sources? So that we want to, that can be both a yes and no question, and it can be like how much of the funding is leveraged from other sources. How does the project align with county plans and needs? I think we've briefly talked about this before, but not only do we have established plans like the comprehensive plan that we talked about in the last meeting, the Parks and Recreation plan, but we also want to keep this one flexible because obviously things change pretty quickly in our community and new priorities and opportunities will likely come up, and we want to make sure that we can align with those as well in how we evaluate these projects. What are the considerations and protections for community safety? So this can be things like, single-use trails, or it can be signage. It can be well-lit areas. It can also be, education around how to engage with animals, wildlife on these trails and things like that. How does the project consider that community safety question? And then finally, what is the project's plan for long-term maintenance and management? Who's taking care of that long-term management? Is there the funding and the capacity available for that in perpetuity? So this draft criteria, again, is very high level, and we wanted to first pose it to you and see if you had any initial feedback or thoughts, how we can, is there something missing? Are some of these two similar and could probably be combined in some way? You don't have to have all those thoughts right now. You can sit with it, and you can feel free to email us or call me or whatever to express your thoughts as well. But I did want to pause and see if there's any initial feedback or input on the high level criteria.
I have one quick thing. This is Lena Richards. On the last bullet, when it says what's the project's plan for long-term management and maintenance, is it implied that that would include some sort of relative cost estimates with potential inflation rates or anything like that? Or should there be a statement or a word or something that says, like, what is the project's plan and possible cost for long-term management and maintenance?
I think we can definitely include that as a question on the application of the cost, as well as the plan for who's managing it and maintaining it. We need to know, is this project expecting that the county would manage it? Because that's a whole other question. Or do they have their own entity and management plan? Maybe they have an organization who's going to be doing trail maintenance and things like that. And that cost question, I think, is going to be critical, and they need to be able to demonstrate that they can, they have the financial and the technical capacity to meet those costs. So I'll make sure that's included in the
Not related to any of those questions, but when we first began the process of looking at grant applications, would we want to say we don't want to try to fund everything right up front? We want to keep some money for later applications that might be related to the Parks and Recreation master plan, for instance. So how would we divide up what we would fund initially, because this is just one pot of money,
right,
and not something that's going to reoccur. So do we want to save some?
So that is largely up to this subcommittee's discretion. Like in this first application window, you might decide that you don't want to recommend any of the project proposals to the commissioners for funding. Ultimately, the commissioners do make the final decision on what does and does not get funded, but this subcommittee can decide, you know, nothing really met our desired threshold for a good project and we want to do another application window. Or you can say, we want to fund these 3 projects and that does not exhaust our pot that we have. And so now we can go out and do another request for proposals and see what else is out there. So this subcommittee can really kind of guide how you want to do that. If you want to spend all the money up front or if you want to try and spread it out over time.
Okay, I just wanted to know whether there was any kind of requirement.
There's not a requirement. The only requirement is that we do have that timeline of the bond in which we have to go to market with the debt. But as long as the funds are allocated in that timeline, then we're good.
And if something is like an application for like a $2 million project, could this committee say, well, we like the idea and we meets all the criteria, but we think that's way too much money, we'll give you partial?
That's a great question that I don't have an answer to, but I think, again, this subcommittee can probably help. I'm curious, how is it done with conservation? Does that happen with the easements where you guys say, like, we don't want to give you this full amount you're asking for, but?
Well, basically how it happens with easements is people generally, when they come to us, they get transaction costs. And then it's an opportunity potentially for easement purchase. First and foremost, we go the grants route to get easement purchase. And then if they either don't qualify for grants or they qualify but weren't awarded, we've applied and weren't awarded, then we can consider giving money for easement purchase. And then generally for agriculture, we do 50% of the value. But that's general, it's not a guarantee. And then even if they get grant funds, if they only get funded, say at 25%, they can request another 25% from the money that we have. So it's not an exact science, but I think it is always important to recognize is that we make recommendations to the commissioners and then the commissioners make the decision. So if we recommend funding a conservation easement, it's within the commissioner's purview to say, no, you know, we'll cover the transaction costs, but we're not paying the easement value. So I think here, if this committee made a recommendation to the commissioners to only fund a portion of it, you would explain that. Here's why we think it should only be funded at X. And the second point for when applications come in, the way I imagine it is there'll be a presentation given to the commissioners that say, here's the pool, here are the applications that we received, here is the one that we recommend funding, or the 2 we recommend, whatever it is, or we don't recommend funding any of these and this is why, and we defend it for or against. That's still up to the commissioners
Or we
to
could
decide.
say we recommend funding it at 50%.
Right, exactly, and we give our reasoning, and then it's, the commissioners have the information they need to make their decision. And I think that's.
We did have a case a couple years ago where we had this chance to protect this huge tract of land that had been owned by a church group. It would have been highly developable, but it was too much, it was a lot of money. And we voted to, because the land trust offered to request certain part of it this year. We had money to fund some projects, and we want to make sure we could fund all we could. And we had enough to do all these other projects, and we had enough to fund part of that project. And we said we approved this with the understanding that the land trust is going to come back next year and ask for funding for the rest of it. And there was time to do that with the other land people that were involved. So we actually did stretch it out over 2 different funding years and protected the whole tract back. So that was just now it's just transaction costs, but it was a lot. And it didn't harm our other projects. We got all the main projects we voted and scored and everything. We were happy with what we got.
I also think if I just draw in my grant experience, if a grant is funding at not the full ask, generally there's a conversation that says, if we can award you 50% of your ask, is this project still feasible? And so I think we want to think about this not just in a vacuum where it's just the application and no communication. We have the opportunity to go back, ask questions, get more information. And maybe they say, yeah, if we can get at least half, we can get match and we can get money over here as well, or, something.
Yeah, and to that point, I think that's a great statement of it's not just we look at the application and we're not engaging back, because the application review will include, there'll be site visits, there'll be basically the applicant will come and present, and you'll be able to ask them questions and have that conversation and be able to make more informed and detailed decisions based on that conversation. I think the initial application is what we'll be scoring, but my vision for the application process is also going to include some, informational webinars. If people are working on their application, they can come to me with questions and things like that. So it'll be more of a conversation and not just say, here's my paper application, judge it blindly and make a decision. So I think that's a great point. Thank you, Jen.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because I've been trying to think about what I'm too close to see right now. And one thing I don't think I've heard answered, maybe it has been, but is are conservation easements going to be required for these projects?
I would say, I think we can, as a group, I think for some projects, there wouldn't really be a conservation easement involved, but it's just asking for improvements on the land. Like if somebody already if an entity owns and manages a property and they want to request funds to put in new trails or something, I don't think a conservation easement.
This is Matt. I think we need to be careful with requiring them to place an easement. I mean, it has to be voluntary as far as certain benefits that a landowner might take advantage of from a tax standpoint. And for us to, put that requirement on might prevent them from being able to do so in certain situations. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't necessarily be able to say that they need to have some type of a deed restriction on it, but I think we need to be careful with the conservation requirements.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In the parks world, how do you ensure that it will be a park into the future? Is it just a deed restriction?
Oftentimes, it's deed restricted.
Certain things are stronger than others.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how permanent a deed restriction is.
But deed restriction would run in perpetuity unless somebody gets away with doing something that's not part of the deed requirement and they are not called out on it. So it would be as restrictive or could be more restrictive than a conservation easement. But it would be a voluntary thing that the owner would place like a conservation easement, but a deed restriction doesn't carry with it certain tax benefits and things like that. But typically a deed restriction, unless it's not enforced, would be in perpetuity or for a length of period that's identified in that restriction and recorded at the Register of Deeds.
So then the question goes, are we going to require a deed restriction? Like that, my whole point in raising the question is how committed is this process to actually the conservation and environmental ethic of the property? Because if it's not put in writing somewhere, then you're kind of just the whole passive recreation aspect of this pot of money can go out the window at any time. So
It sounds like if it's a conservation easement, those are usually in perpetuity. If there's not a conservation easement, it sounds like maybe we would need to have deed restrictions so that it would be in perpetuity.
Maybe if it's the county, it's safer. We know what we're doing with our landscape, but as we consider partners applying for the money, I think that's where it becomes a need for a more robust conversation.
Maybe this would be we can invite the staff attorney to join a future meeting and ask what the options are for contracts with projects of how we can put in some of these protections against funding something that then turns into
Could you
totally
give
not
an
possible.
example of like, if the county doesn't own it, a private, maybe a church,
Right.
or a camp?
Or even
owns it.
another municipality.
Yeah, so how then would that work as far as restrictions in perpetuity?
I think that's, I would like to have the staff attorney join one of these meetings and he can help explain, because I don't know all of the options for how to put in those restrictions, but he would be able to shed more light on what we can put in the contracts for the grant funding, because every project, or not grant funding, the bond funding, every project that we fund, we're gonna have a contract with them that puts out the stipulations of what this money is going for, how they can use it, what oversight they need to meet, things like that. And so I think our staff attorney can shed more light on what legal options we can use to restrict how these plans can be changed over time.
One of the things I want to point out that's interesting in this conversation is we've been uplifting Collier Cove as a passive recreation example within the county. An interesting thing to know about Collier Cove is that that land was donated to us by the Collier family. It is deed restricted over to the county for the specific uses of parks and conservation and such, but there's no easement. But to Matt's point, there's stipulations in there that says that if we do X, Y, or Z, that the lands revert back to the Collier family. So even though we own the land-ish, we kind of don't own the land-ish because we've got this agreement with them and it's a legally bound document and it's noted in plats in the deed. And so I think there's a way to leverage things to that point, but I just want to highlight what it is that Thomas is saying is if we don't require anything and someone comes, even if it's another municipality, and they say, hey, for our municipality, we want to do this, we need to find out what are our insurances that we get our value back, because does it need to be in perpetuity or does it need to be for whatever the value of what we're giving you? So we've given you $2 million, we value that passive recreation out X amount of years of public access. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's a conversation that needs to be had because maybe it doesn't need to be in perpetuity, right? We all would love it to be. I mean, maybe I would love it to be. I'm a parks director, but if it's not going to be in perpetuity, how do we ensure that the county is getting the value out of what it is they're putting in? And so that would be a question for the attorney.
It's also kind of interesting to think about. I wouldn't expect something like this to happen, but say Black Mountain says, we need to purchase this plot of land, and yeah, sure, we'll have it as a park. And in 5 years, housing pressure is so much that Black Mountain says, actually, we need to build an apartment complex on this landscape. Is that allowed? I mean, it's their land, or would we expect them to compensate us back for the loss of a park? Well, that's an interesting example because we also acknowledge that housing is a huge issue in this community. And so, I don't know.
I think that's where the value question comes.
Exactly. And so I think that although maybe not overly likely, I think we do need to be thinking about the process in a way that not everybody values parks in the same way. Is true.
Well, and because that also speaks to the voters' intention question. To your point, it sounds like the voters really want to see the land being conserved from future development. But in that scenario, like, we're not really meeting that voter intention if that land then gets repurposed.
Exactly.
So it seems to me, if you're trying to, you get this opportunity to do something, protect passive parks land and everything, you write the documentation up to protect it. The intention is it's supposed to be protected. There shouldn't ever, in that case, there shouldn't ever be an issue that, oh, but we want to build apartments on here now. Sorry, that's not allowed by the law. That's why we made this agreement 50 years ago or whatever. That's just the way legality works. Now, if you write it in there, well, we would consider possibly a, 50 apartment building on this stretch or something, but that sounds more like a conservation easement, where you make these agreements with the owners that they may want to build a house for their son on this piece, but we'll protect everything else in perpetuity. Just seems to me that we don't want to fuzzy it up right from the beginning. If we're going to protect it, we want to say we want to protect it.
And I'm not suggesting we fuzzy it up. I was just saying that I think that's what Thomas is getting at. It's like, how are we ensuring that? Is it an easement? Is it a deed restriction?
Yeah, I mean, you hit at the point that like, not everybody thinks the same things about parks as like other people in this room, right?
Yeah.
Like parks currently are getting developed all the time, maybe not in this county, but they do get developed for private purposes.
I think these are all great, it's a great conversation. I would be interested in hearing, it would be great to have the city attorney or excuse me, county attorneys, somebody that could give us some feel for how other properties are restricted or managed, or, you know, are there any properties that have, what happens if the, you know, development pressures, or do we need to actually have a consideration in our guidelines that look at what potential future development pressure might be on a certain area to be able to say whether or not there is a reason that there would be any flexibility. You know, ideal world, you know, it stays a park forever, but in terms of understanding development patterns and pressures, there may be something that we need to consider. And I think it would be a great idea to have the attorneys come in and see what maybe other properties in the county, how they're managed and operated in that sense.
I'll speak with the attorneys and make sure that we can have them come to it.
And also look into what other counties or municipalities have done in regard to those issues.
Yeah.
Because I know you gave examples in Wake County.
Yeah, how are those
Yeah.
protected? That's a really good point. So I do know we're running on time, so I had a couple questions that I wanted to pitch to this group to think about. We don't have to answer them right now, but at least think about them. As first, you know, that question around, do we want to have separate tracks for acquisition projects and improvement projects, and separate, you know, requirements for those? What of the potential criteria do we want to make requirements, like eligibility criteria versus weighted criteria? So things like that question of, do we want to require a feasibility study? Obviously, location within Buncombe County is something that would be required, but are we going to require that they have leveraged other funding sources? Other pieces that we might want to say, you have to meet this in order to move forward in the process. And also, are there additional criteria that's not included on this list that you'd like to see included? Or is there ways to kind of creatively combine some that might be overlapping or even distinguish them further? And then my final question that I'd love for this subcommittee to think about is, if there's other questions or ideas that you want to bring to the community as we wrap up the public engagement process. We are fortunate with passive recreation that we have like a longer runway, so we can go back, we can see what the public has said, and we can say, we want to know more about that. And I know parsing out some of the questions of safety came up as an additional criteria, but how does that compare with the initial proposed characteristics? That's one that we can definitely bring back to the community. But if there's other questions or ideas that this group would like to ask, we can do that too.
Are you okay if we share this presentation with other people?
Yeah, this meeting is live streamed, so it's open to the public. So you're welcome to share. Yeah. And then kind of just to give a sense of next steps, as I mentioned, we are in the middle of a kind of a Spanish language focused public engagement push right now. There's a Spanish language focused boards and subcommittees fair on Thursday that we're going to be talking about this board at. We're also going to be trying to host a Spanish language public engagement meeting like we did with the other two community meetings. And our CAPE team has put out a lot of great Spanish language content, as well as getting the survey out in Spanish as well. And then we'll refine the criteria based on your feedback and based on additional public input that we received. And then hopefully in September, we'll be able to start seeking approvals of refined, finalized criteria. All right. So with that, I do want to pause while we still have 2 minutes. If there's any public comment, Caroline, do we have anyone from the public? No. Okay. And then before we adjourn, our next meeting will be taking place on August 15th at 12 p.m. in this room. I put this in the email, but our schedule moving forward is going to be every 3rd Tuesday of the month. Obviously, the subcommittee can choose to be less frequent or change that schedule if you find it's necessary or not necessary to meet on a monthly basis, which after the criteria development, you might very well choose that you want to meet every other month or something. But until that point, we will be meeting every 3rd Tuesday at 12 p.m. in this room. So, Kevin, would you like to call for a motion? Or unless there's any other points or questions or thoughts before we adjourn, actually. Then Kevin, if you'd like to call for a motion to adjourn.
Certainly. I appreciate you leading this meeting today, and I've really enjoyed the conversations we've had. Some great points were brought up. And I would just like to thank everyone for showing up and giving their input. But I would like to propose a motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Second, aye.
Excellent. Meeting adjourned. We'll see you all next month.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.